This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Aaron David Miller was a top U.S. negotiator, historian, and foreign policy advisor working under 6 U.S. presidents. No matter which party controlled the White House, as a civil servant, his job was to help the president work through some very difficult foreign policy decisions. He was a top U.S. negotiator in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. He has an incredible knowledge of history, and he's widely respected as someone who tells it as it is, especially on very complicated, fast-moving global events. 1 year into the Biden administration, we talked with him about how President Biden's doing, here at home as well as abroad, and what he thinks of this moment in history. As a quick reminder, all of our events are taped 100% live. For info on how to join us, past episodes, and our very special illustrious email list, visit us at pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So, Aaron, we just had an anniversary of January 6th, which was the whole interrupting of congressional business, the election, the big lie, so on and so forth, the insurrection. From your perspective, what has the impact been on U.S. foreign policy and capacity after January 6th?
You know, I can't speak for other periods of dysfunction in American history. When the domestic travails of the Republic were so severe. I mean, a few come to mind, obviously, the period leading up to the Civil War and Civil War, 30s, the Great Depression, the 50s with McCarthyism, the 60s with all the domestic turmoil, anti-Vietnam sentiment, racial inequality, riots in our major cities, Watergate, Iran-Contra. But I have to say, and I've been in the biz, I'm 70, going to turn 73 soon. I've been in the foreign policy biz, either in government or trying to explain what we did right or wrong over the course of the last 20 years since leaving government. Never have I seen a greater connection between America's domestic dysfunction and our capacity, credibility, and competence, the way we are literally the way we are perceived by our allies and by our adversaries. It is as destructive and as dangerous a period as I think we've witnessed in the modern history of the Republic. You might argue, actually, that over the course of the last 18 months, two sets of events have, in some respects, dovetailed. One, of course, was January 6, 2021, an insurrection, an assault, a basic effort to obstruct and prevent a peaceful transition of power, which has never occurred since South Carolina seceded from the Union in the wake, first state to secede in the wake of Abraham Lincoln's election, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We can talk more about that, but these two events seem to me to bookend much of the problem. We now live in a glass house. And while I am a fervent believer in the American experiment and fully cognizant of all of its imperfections and its difficulties in reconciling the rights of African Americans, of women, of indigenous peoples with realities contained both in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, our founding documents. I have to say I've never seen a period in my years doing this business in which our very competence and credibility is as fraught abroad as it is now. It worries allies in the extreme, and to a large degree, it delights adversaries who see it as a sign not just of dysfunction, but of American weakness and American decline. And I would have started any discussion of Biden's foreign policy. I'm a Tolkien fan, with the one ring to rule them all. And the one ring to rule them all, if Biden were joining us on this conversation, he would say there is no greater foreign policy challenge that we confront or combination of challenges that presents a greater danger to this republic and, of course, to my presidency than the 3 or 4 domestic crises that we face abroad. And that, frankly, Justin, I would argue, that sets the table for any discussion of Joe Biden's foreign policy. And I would argue to you limits what he can get done abroad and pushes domestic politics to a large degree and an unhealthy degree as a constraint in defining foreign policy. So I don't want to whistle past the graveyard here. I've been arguing with my kids for the last 2 years about how fraught the dangers are that we face. They have been much more concerned and much more accurate, frankly, in predicting this dysfunction than I was even from the beginning with Trump's election. But this is the key. It's America at home that I'm most concerned about.
No, I do appreciate that, Aaron. But let's kind of, after setting the table now, let's get into something you just touched on, Afghanistan. So as a kid, I was very young when the World Trade Centers hit. I think, in probably 5th or 6th grade. And my life has largely been shaped, U.S. foreign policy, by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had you on the show, and you were advocating for a pullout. You always said it would be messy. But there was a consensus that the Biden administration's approach was sloppy, haphazard. They had 7 months to get our U.S. partners out from Afghanistan, who helped our translators, who helped our guides, and they didn't. So I'm wondering, how does the world view the United States' credibility on the world stage after we ended a near 20-year engagement in such a disastrous manner? Or, Aaron, was this always going to be this messy?
To the latter point, I think the answer is no. It didn't have to be this messy. But withdrawal from a losing war in which the opponents on the ground are surging militarily and have tremendous advantage when it comes to what can happen when. I think, combined with the president's willful decision to get out at any cost, which was, in my judgment, the riskiest foreign policy decision he's made. I think that decision has enhanced to a large degree some of the risk aversion, perhaps in other areas. No, I don't think it had to be this messy. And there are so many aspects to this. Mike McFaul is now pressing the State Department to have hearings, and if the Republicans take the House in 2022, there will be hearings, a la similar to Benghazi. And I'm not equating the two at all on both the process and the decisions that were made with respect to withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think, look, the administration's analysis, and remember, good policy flows from honest analysis. There were analytical flaws, a lack of preparation. And I would argue not to undermine, because most of the folks that are running the national security apparatus of the United States are very well known to me. A few are close friends. But I think there was a missing ingredient here of someone with the experience and operational knowledge that knew how to move the planes, boats, and trains around. Again, evacuating 124,000 people under these circumstances is no small matter. But the assumptions on which the withdrawal was based, that it might be 6 months before the Afghan military collapsed, for example, that somehow there would be a way to extricate special immigrant visa Afghans and a number of other categories of Afghans are at risk. And then, of course, the whole issue of quote unquote, leaving Americans behind. All of these things and the pictures, akin to some degree to this 1975 extrication from Vietnam, but much, much more because of social media, because of the transparency and the competency of the media, their willful desire and capacity to write up these stories and actually be on the ground. Those images will forever be associated with the Biden administration and a stain on the Biden administration. Now, the other question, just to briefly dispatch it, will the withdrawal fundamentally, does the withdrawal fundamentally mean that America is not prepared to discharge its commitments in other areas? Ukraine, Taiwan come to mind.
Yeah. Let me put a fine point on this. If you were a negotiator in the State Department on these issues, what would the impact of Afghanistan have been?
Well, in the academic literature is pretty consistent on this. That is to say, the United States policy on issue A, particularly if it is not considered to be a vital national interest of the United States, and we can argue all day long about whether or not Afghanistan constituted a vital national interest to the United States. I would argue no, with a lot of asterisks. But the academic literature suggests that just because country A acts in a certain way toward issue B does not mean that country A will act the same way toward issue C, D, and E, particularly if issue C, D, E are considered vital national interests to the United States. I would just point out that Vietnam, which was clearly the most significant American defeat and debacle in the post-war period, by 1991, all of this notion that the United States could no longer discharge its commitments, that the United States was on decline, it was no longer a superpower. Within 15 years of Vietnam, the United States had reasserted its influence and its credibility during a very critical period in which the former Soviet Union was collapsing. Now, I would argue to you that kind of transition is no longer possible, but it has less to do with Afghanistan and the debacle of the U.S. withdrawal. By the way, the idea of withdrawal was not the debacle. It was the process by which the withdrawal was carried out. But there are so many other factors that have now fundamentally altered the international environment, which, in my judgment, means a serious rethinking of America's role in the world and an abandonment. And I say this with no reluctance. One of my former bosses, Madeleine Albright, borrowed a term from Bill Clinton. And again, we interviewed her on Carnegie Connects. It's really an interview worth hearing. The notion that the U.S. will somehow today, with all of its domestic travails, and given that the increasing multipolarity of the world, where powers large and small are able, for so many reasons, to challenge the notion of a unipolar world, that role is no longer possible, and I would argue it's no longer desirable. My friend Bill Burns, who's now running the CIA, talks about the U.S. as a pivotal power. It's a much better sort of notion. That is to say, the U.S. can pivot in and to areas that really are vital to its national interests. And I think the time has come. We don't have an alternative to begin to distinguish what is a vital American national interest as opposed to a discretionary one. The time has come to understand that foreign policy begins at home, and that the real source of our power is our domestic resilience, our economy, our capacity and willingness to stand up with a functional democratic system with all of its imperfections. That is the source of American power. It is not to be confused with all of the bells and whistles of the U.S. military. After all, military power is a means to an end. And if it's used unwisely, And if it's not focused in a way that understands why a president should direct Americans to be in harm's way, then I think it ends up to be a disaster. And I have called both Iraq and Afghanistan to, perhaps unkindly, with no intention of diminishing or devaluing the sacrifice and service of the men and women who serve there. I've called them trillion-dollar social science projects because from a political point of view, our aspirations, our investment, what we put into these two wars, the two longest wars in American history, did never justify the return and caused untold misery, even with the resurgence of institutions in Afghanistan and the empowerment of women and girls and our efforts to help stabilize Iraq. The real question was, once al-Qaeda was defeated, were these wars of necessity or were these wars of choice? And did we think clearly enough about the questions that any president should ask before one day she commits Americans to harm's way? Not just can we do it, but should we do it? What will it cost? And is there some set of achievable political goals that's tethered to the use of military force? And I just believe that both of these wars has created a measure of risk aversion, which I think can influence American policy when it comes to protecting interests that are truly vital.
We're going to hit on Iran, then we're going to do China, then we're going to do Russia, then we're going to go to audience questions. Aaron, specifically, the Biden team has attempted to shift away from the Trump approach on several key issues, NATO being one, and arguably the biggest being their effort to revive an Iranian nuclear deal. While a deal hasn't been finalized, what do you actually make of these efforts, the strategy behind this, and the prospects for a deal? Because really quickly, some people argue that maybe a tactical military strike is the most proper resolution instead of buying time to continue to negotiate.
I mean, look, I think I just spoke to another close friend, Rob Malley, who's in Vienna doing these Iran negotiations. And, I think that the problem with Iran and the U.S.-Iranian relationship is that I don't see an end state. I don't see a stable U.S.-Iranian relationship, given the gaps that separate these two countries on issues that are fundamental, given the nature of the Iranian regime, given the toxic issue of politics in the U.S. No one, not a Democrat, I shouldn't say not a Democrat or a Republican. There may be a few that would celebrate and break open the champagne bottles if, in fact, Rob Malley ended up negotiating something akin to a return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But the chorus is going to be largely negative. Biden isn't going to get any political points. In fact, you could even make the argument that his political advisors might even say to him, as we approach the midterms, the last thing you need to do is reach an agreement with Iran that somehow suggests you've given when you should have taken, somehow suggests that you've overcompensated. This is not a politically issue filled with opportunities for the president. We cannot transform the U.S.-Iranian relationship. At best, we can reach a series of what I call transactional arrangements. That's what the initial Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was designed to do. It was I think, a extraordinary example of American diplomacy, however flawed it was. And it was flawed because it was designed to do two things: to preempt the possibility of an Israeli military strike, as distant as that may have appeared then, and I still believe as distant as it appears now, and to make an American military strike unnecessary. It was not designed to fundamentally alter the contours of the U.S.-Iranian relationship, which, in my judgment, much like our relationship with China right now and with Russia, is a question of what I call managed. Actually, it's not my expression. And if you want someone on your Clubhouse, Politics 101, Justin, get Evan Feigenbaum to talk about China. Evan's notion is the best we're going to be able to do with the Chinese is managed enmity. Now, that could be trimmed back a tad, and there are issues where we can cooperate. But with the U.S. and Iran, I see it's managing fundamental divisions between governments on a variety of issues that are simply not malleable. So the decision to try to reach an agreement that constrains Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions is, in my judgment, the best you're going to be able to do. But it is so imperfect because it does not address any number of other issues, which were not a part of the original negotiations in 2015, which will continue to pose a good deal of problems. And there are humans who argue that the real problem is not the nuclear issue. Iran may be 2 years away. They may be 3 weeks away of their capacity to enrich enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon, but they're at least 2 years away from actually trying to miniaturize the warhead, develop a physics package and a delivery system. It raises the whole question about nuclear tests. But the real danger is a conflict in the region, either between Israel and Iran that escalates, or a pro-Iranian Iraqi militia attacks, as they have, American positions in Syria or Iraq. Half a dozen Americans are killed. And then the Biden administration responds. We haven't seen that yet, although we've come close. So again, to me, and I know this is unsatisfactory, it's not pretty, it's emotionally very unsatisfying. Buying time is still, in my judgment, and I think even the one country in the region that has been most associated with a kinetic response, the Israelis. I think even the Israelis have come to believe, given the fact that an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear sites is so fraught with risk and so, how can I put this, is going to be so disappointing in terms of the returns, that the Israelis will frankly have created a bigger problem than the one they were designed to address with the military strike. So, no, I think for any number of reasons, war with Iran is a bad idea. And again, I come back to the central question and my central theme in evaluating any American foreign policy issue right now that gets the United States bogged down into some sort of foreign adventure. What kind of impact does it have on the domestic front? I mean, I voted for Democrats and Republicans. I've worked for Democrats and Republicans. I'm an admirer, full disclosure here, of Joe Biden. And I just think that the reason that the United States, I think, is interested, and I can't think of another Middle Eastern issue in which this administration is committed to. They're interested in Iran because a conflict is going to guarantee rising oil prices and falling markets. It's going to guarantee an enormous amount of attention for a president whose bandwidth, as we approach midterms, is so narrow, and who has several other key domestic priorities, all of which look right now, Build Back Better or movement on either of the key voting rights bills, which is critically important. Those initiatives, the future looks pretty grim. And I come back to if Biden were here, he would say it again. There's no foreign policy issue out there that poses a greater danger to the republic. And he'd have to add to my presidency than the issues we face. I'll quote Game of Thrones here. He'd see the kingdom burn if he could be king of the ashes. He'd see the kingdom burn if he could be king of the ashes. We're dealing with a potential. Heather Cox Richardson, who I'm having on my Carnegie Connects in a week or so, told Ken Burns the other day in an interview that, in her view, 19th century historian that she is, 2022 could be one of the most critical and crucial years in the history of the American Republic. And that you could say the same about 2023 and 2024. So again, sorry to drone on about this, but it's got to be tethered. It's got to be tethered, given the fact that a president is responsible for the security and well-being of the American people. First priority. Foreign policy initiatives, in my judgment, need to be weighed against the priorities that we face here at home. And frankly, I cannot think of a single one. I would think of climate. And climate is, but climate, again, is so inextricably linked to domestic politics and the domestic economy. I can't think of a foreign policy challenge that is more dangerous or deadly to what's coming.
But I wanted to move on to China, and then we'll hit Russia. So this is something where there's been continuity between the Biden administration and Trump administration. We've had, Miles, you, a former top State Department advisor to Mike Pompeo, with China on. He led the State Department's investigation into the coronavirus lab outbreak investigation. And he was very, very pleased at the approach that the Biden administration has taken to China. And they've actually taken a step further, where the Trump administration was mainly focused on economics, think of trade wars, tariffs, so on and so forth. The Biden administration has taken that economic approach. They've also taken a military approach with AUKUS and sending nuclear submarines and creating a deal, at least, with Australia. But they've also taken that critical step with human rights, where the Trump administration released some words and maybe haphazard sanctions. The Biden administration has taken full global approach with not sending diplomats to the Olympics and then building up multilateral relations with other countries in their approach to China. Is China a place where the United States can begin to lead again, create coalitions, restore some of our perceptions on the global stage, and really use this to more our foreign policy approach in something where we can create shared values with other countries around the world?
I mean, look, people are going to forget more about China than I'm ever going to know. But I would just inject a few cautionary notes here. I do think that there are similarities with Trump policy. There's no question about it. And Biden is now struggling with the issue of tariffs, even though I think on balance they may be quite harmful on the domestic side. It's very difficult for him to take any action on China that appears to be weak, given the public perception of China and the elites and congressional constraints. In fact, there's a fair degree of bipartisan consensus on being tough with China. The problem is that consensus also prevents America from expanding its influence in an effort to counter or contain China. We can't join an expanded TPP. China has created its own Trade Organization, which is now the RCEP, which is now the largest trade association in the world. I think it's 1/3 of the world's GDP. I mean, we're not going to join that, but we can't join the expanded TPP because of the toxicity of trade practices with respect to, in this case, the Democratic Party. That's one problem. Number two, I don't believe when Kurt Campbell said, actually on the question, he said, if you want a serious China policy, Kurt, don't you have to have an Asia policy first? And he agreed. And that's what AUKUS and the Quad are all about. That fundamentally differs from the Trump administration. Trump administration so alienated allies. And again, I realize there's a sort of a contradiction here because you have the French fried diplomacy problem over AUKUS, which I think is being repaired. But, you know, the Australians wanted nuclear-powered subs, not diesel-powered. The Brits wanted in. It was a sort of Anglophone, Australia, U.S. Why let the French in? I don't think this was a State Department failure. I think it was a problem with the White House. But AUKUS is significant. It represents a material part of the pivot. The Quad is significant. That did not occur during the Trump administration. I think there's another similarity which is difficult for me to handle, and I've written about this, and that is if the president is arguing that control of the 21st century is a battle between democracies and autocracies, or democracies and authoritarian powers, that's a problematic conceit for the United States. And I understand the power of democracy support and promotion. I mean, every American president has used that trope. And as Biden told Putin, it is who we are. I get it. There's a legitimate issue there. But if in fact you divide the world into democracies and autocracies, and you force other countries to take sides, you're not going to be very successful. The Germans won't like it. The Italians won't like it. There are any number of our Asian partners out there who, for geographic and economic reasons, do not want to make that choice. And I would argue will not make that choice. Will not make that choice. Then there's the other issue of can the problems that confront the planet today, maintenance of biodiversity, pandemic, climate, problems in the global economy, can any of this be remedied without the cooperation of regimes whose values we do not share? And I worry about this. And I was going to make the point to you that, you know, in Joe Biden's DNA, there is the aspirational leader. America is back at the head of the table. We will lead the free world. And, you know, I am compelled by that. I really am. But we have to be, because we live in a glass house now, and we do, a very transparent glass house where our contradictions and our own violations and discrimination when it comes to minority groups, our own racial inequality, income inequality, dysfunctional political system. I mean, June 13th, despite the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu learned a lot from Donald Trump, and they melded because they were in the same populist mode, on June 13th, when the government of Israel changed, there were no attacks on the Knesset. There was no big lie, which basically was supported by one of the two major political parties in Israel. I worry a lot. There's a wonderful line from Shakespeare, Henry IV, that Jack Kennedy really loved. One character says to the other, I love this, I can summon the spirits from the vasty deep. And the other one replies, but so can any man. The question is, do they come when you call? That's the problem we have now. will our allies come when we call, given our own dysfunction and the conviction on the part of most of our allies that 2022 is going to be a disaster? The average loss since 1946 of the incumbent president's party in the first midterm is 25 seats in the House and Senate. That 2022 is going to be a disaster. They're going to lose control of the House. You could end up with impeachment proceedings. I can see it. And 2024, he'd be king of the ashes. If he'd see the kingdom burn if he could be king of the ashes. May well decide to run for president. And it's still an arguable proposition that Biden will. He says he will if he's healthy. And only one president in the history of this republic ever declared during the beginning of his first term that he would not seek a second. And he laid out the 3 or 4 objectives that he wanted to achieve, and he achieved them all. James Polk. Basically, every president wants a second term. When Obama toyed with the idea in 2009, I think that that he might not run again. He made some comment. I just laughed. So again, I think China is a pure competitor. I think Evan Feigenbaum is right. I think for the foreseeable future, managed enmity is probably the best we're going to do. There are areas that we can cooperate, if not together on the same page, then through a sort of complementarity. Climate is one of those, and John Kerry has tried to forge a personal relationship and a functional one. But on climate, the problem goes way beyond China, even though it's the largest single emitter of greenhouse gases. Nonetheless, it's going to be extremely difficult, largely because of the politics on both sides.
Let's say that Russia actually does invade Ukraine because Putin's just crazy. If you've been following Michael McCall on Twitter, he has some great threads and there's some great back and forth. But what type of challenge does a Russian invasion of Ukraine make for Biden's State Department in achieving other realistic goals, foreign policy-wise, in 2022?
Concessions.
I mean, that's in some respects, a thought experiment question, because is the invasion of Ukraine an effort to solidify or expand Russian control in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine? Is it a full-scale invasion designed to take Kiev? I mean, what is Putin going to do? And then, of course, you've got the Allied response in NATO. It'll certainly, if Putin decides to launch a significant or serious military action. Again, my former boss, Jim Baker, said on another Carnegie Connect, we interviewed him, he said, if you go looking for a fight, you're likely to find one. And if I had a bet, and I realize this is risky, if you look at Russian interventions elsewhere in Georgia, in Syria, in Crimea, it's really Putin carefully assesses and calculates the cost, benefits, the risks and rewards here. He needs a trigger. He needs solid support where he's going to deploy Russian forces. He needs some sense of how the West is going to react. Will it fundamentally harm him personally, domestically? How's the Russian public going to respond? I mean, Ukraine's 43 million people. If it's such a brotherly nation, how is the Russian public going to respond when you have a massive Russian invasion and occupation, and then you have the prospects of a Ukrainian insurgency? It strikes me that the downsides of a major move by Putin outweigh the upsides. But, Ukraine is very special to him. And he's made the case. He's climbed up a pretty high tree in terms of what he would expect from NATO, from the United States, in the way of concessions, and Biden's bandwidth for making them are very narrow. So if again, it really depends on the nature and the size, the expansiveness of the Russian action. Biden will be able to emerge, it seems to me, as the leader of and again, the Poles and the Brits want a much tougher policy than the Germans, the French, and the Italians here. The Post had an editorial today, which I tweeted out because I couldn't contain myself. They drew the analogy between Putin and Ukraine and Hitler and Munich, and then of course the Allies. And I tweeted out that if in fact Ukraine is a Munich moment, as the Post argued, understanding that sometimes the analogy is overstated or overused, but they made it anyway. If Ukraine is a Munich moment, isn't the United States obligated to do everything? And I don't use caps ever, but in this case I did. Everything to oppose Putin, including the possible consequence of a military confrontation with Russia? I think we have to be extremely careful here. And while I understand 100% why Biden doesn't accept, and neither did Obama, the notion of spheres of influence, this is a loser for us, it seems to me. So again, I think Biden will portray he will deliver on what he promised, separating large Russian financial institutions from American banks, whether or not the SWIFT system, which allows financial transfers, 200 countries, supposed to be a politically neutral organization. We stiff-armed them to cut off the Iranians for a while, and we probably could do so again. But then again, you have blowback from American companies and from other Europeans. The Germans are sitting there. It's winter. The Russians control gas deliveries. They're already experiencing shortages. It's going to be messy. It's not the United States standing up to the Japanese in 1941, and it's not Churchill standing up to the Germans. It's much more complicated. It'll be a huge distraction for Biden. He can play the role of tough leader, but frankly, I think that's what's expected of him. If he does anything less, he'll be hammered. And that's the other problem here. We need to respond to Putin in Ukraine with as much counter as we can without creating a situation that would lead to additional escalation. And I think it's going to be very hard.
Okay, so we're going to go to an expert. He is really a cybersecurity ace. Don't want to blow up his spot too much. Just click on his bio, though, folks. You can see he founded CrowdStrike. So we're going to go to Dimitri first. Dimitri, we'd love to have you on again, and then we'll go to Shanette. Dimitri, over to you.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you, Aaron, for your thoughts here. I posted a long thread that some may have read on Twitter about why I think an invasion is very likely. I think that Putin is signaling to us in many ways, including with facts on the ground, in terms of the type of the buildup of forces that we have there, with the kind of outrageous diplomatic statements that they're making in terms of demanding ironclad concessions immediately, not wanting prolonged negotiations. They're painting themselves into a corner from which it's very, very hard for them to get out without a significant win. I think all of that indicates that they are preparing to invade, that they're ready to invade, they're willing to take the consequences. I don't necessarily think that they'll go into Western Ukraine. I don't think they'll hit Kiev, but they will go up to the Dnieper and try to take as much of Eastern Ukraine as they can, gambling on the fact that a lot of that population is pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, and they can probably keep it fairly pacified and contain any impact of the insurgency. But my question to you, Aaron, is if you were in the negotiation table across from the Russians on Monday with Wendy Sherman, what kind of concessions would you consider giving them to try to preempt an invasion?
Dimitri, thanks. I'm out of my depth here. I know a lot about negotiations, but again, sometimes they don't translate between A, B, C, and D. Well, first of all, you could pocket things that we already don't intend to do, and that is to deploy short-range missiles or any missiles in Ukraine. I suppose, and the New York Times reported a couple of weeks ago that the State Department, unnamed sources, have already told Ukrainians don't even think about NATO membership for at least a decade. And frankly, I think it would be insane even to do a preliminary map with Ukraine, provide a pathway to NATO membership. I think it would be a mistake. You could think about, and again, the background briefing that I don't know if you heard it. That I don't know who it was. I would assume it was Jake Sullivan, but it's online. You can read it. Talked about reciprocity. That any concession that we would make would have to be reciprocated, not in terms of things that the Russians would do, but reciprocated on in the same issue that we were conceding. So I suppose you could look at restrictions on military exercises, which are annoying to the Russians, but there would have to be an equally compelling Russian response. I mean, I don't think Biden is in a position, nor would I advise him to make any concessions on NATO, even though NATO in Ukraine or Ukraine in NATO. I share your pessimism because I love what my former boss Jim Baker said, that if you go looking for a fight, you're likely to find one. But I also realize that Putin is a master calculator. He's already got our attention. He's already got an agenda that is largely the one that he has proposed. He's caught Europe and hopes to keep it divided. My only thought about how this is going to turn out is no matter what happens, Ukraine is going to be a source of fraught tension between the United States and the West in large part because everything Putin is doing, and if you're right, and he makes a significant move to Dnieper, but not further west, he's going to further solidify an already mounting sense of Ukrainian nationalism and anti-Russian attitudes, which is going to further reinforce not just the headline, but the trend line that Ukraine is moving west. Now, maybe you're right. Maybe he sees that, and maybe he's determined to stop it. But right now, I don't see, similar to the U.S.-Iran negotiations, a pathway that will create a balance of interest that would satisfy Putin, and B, make it unmistakably clear that Biden is more than holding his own. He's demanding reciprocity from the Russians.
So, Dimitri, real quick, if I were to turn your question on to you, what would you give up if you're on the negotiating table?
So I agree with Aaron that I think any attempts to give up on NATO expansion is just not feasible politically for the Biden administration. The Europeans would be outraged domestically. They would be skewered in Congress. Although I do think it's ironic that if Putin does invade and if it goes well for him and he takes a good chunk out of Ukraine, maybe half of it, the eastern half, he'll effectively establish a Putin doctrine, which is that if any former Soviet Union country, except for the Baltics, wants to join NATO, they will be under threat of invasion. And that will de facto forestall any further NATO expansion to the east. So he will get what he wants without us granting it to him. But I don't think we can put it on the table. But what I would try to do, and I had this in a second long thread that I published last week, is try to find a way to buy time. I think that there is an opportunity to say to him that, look, we're willing to have prolonged conversations about European security, which would be essentially a renegotiation of sort of a new treaty on conventional forces in Europe that the Russians pulled out of. And it will have a range of issues, including potentially NATO expansion, but also troop deployments, missiles, and other matters. But those negotiations will take a long time. They will not be done next week, next month, or even this year. It will take a couple of years. And while we're committing to going down the path to negotiating this, we need to figure out what would prevent him from thinking that he needs to act now. And in my mind, the reason why he's escalating today versus a year from now, 5 years from now, is he believes that the status quo is changing on the ground in Ukraine with some of the military assistance that Ukraine has gotten, particularly the TB2 drones from Turkey, which he has witnessed do tremendous damage to Armenia in their war with Azerbaijan. In 2020, he has seen those drones being used in Libya, including against Russian Wagner forces and in Syria. He thinks that they're a game changer, not necessarily against the Russian military, but against the Donbass separatists. He thinks he doesn't like the javelins. He doesn't like the NATO advisors. So I think some sort of proposal that we're willing to freeze any new aid so that the status quo gets frozen while we're negotiating, so that he always has that option in the back pocket to invade if he chooses to believe that the negotiations are not going well. But preventing him from doing that now is where I would focus and try to figure out what would make them to hit the pause button, essentially.
Thank you very much. This is awesome. A little back and forth there. So we will go to Shanette, who worked for the first George Bush, and then we'll go to Max. Shanette, over to you.
Thanks so much, Justin. And Aaron, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. You talked about how our domestic issues are affecting international and foreign policy. And part of what you've discussed is the constraints on foreign policy because will our allies come when we call, and sort of rebuilding our credibility with our allies. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of will the U.S. support moves by the Biden administration when we make a move, given that we're so divided, and we still have like statements by Trump supporting Orban and Tucker Carlson posing the question, why not support Putin over the Ukrainians? So I'd love for you to get your thoughts on sort of, is that, it seems to me like that's also a major sticking point for what we can and can't do internationally. And what do you think, how do we get past that? So thanks.
Yeah, I think the issue of bipartisanship works both ways. As I pointed out, there's a lot of bipartisanship on preventing the United States from joining trade pacts, which would allow us to counter Chinese economic influence in Asia. At the same time, there is a remarkable degree of confluence on issues like China. China's bad, the U.S. is good. On Putin, Putin's a monster. We need to stop him. On Iran as well, not just on the Republican side, but on the part of mainstream, moderate, and clearly conservative Democrats. I would like to think, even though I'm looking back and trying to find a moment in the last several years when there was some internal or external crisis that the majority of Americans could experience together. I mean, we're well past a 9/11 moment in terms of the country drawing together and the president serving as a sort of moral leader and champion of American security in the face of a crisis. I suspect that we'll avoid a military confrontation with the Russians if in fact Dmitry is right and they actually do press to expand significantly their control over eastern Ukraine. That Americans and the media will draw together, assuming that the response is perceived to be effective. There will be a segment of the Republican Party that I think will decry anything that Biden does, and there will be a number of Republican senators like Rand Paul who are against the deployment of American resources. And there will be those who will argue that this is some sort of political stunt by the administration. I don't think you'll get again, you're not going to see Americans in combat. So it doesn't, pose the politics stops at the water's edge test. I think the real danger, and again, it's somewhat off your point, but I think it's worth noting. The real danger here is not that we're arguing over immigration, over the size of a child welfare credit, or Build Back Better. The debate in America today, sadly, unfortunately, is over the issue of identity. Who is an American, and what does it mean to be an American? I mean, this is as fundamental a divide, certainly as I've ever experienced in my lifetime, and one that was raised at various points within over the course of the modern history of the United States, during the 50s with McCarthyism, during the 60s, but never, it seems to me, with the sort of tribal aspects that we have today. And it's just hard for me to envision a national moment in which Democrats and Republicans, I mean, you saw the response to January 6th. Flashback to 9/11, when you had almost the entire Congress singing God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol. Well, you had a lot of Democrats there, maybe with Adam Kinzinger or at least Liz Cheney. I just don't. I think your concern is right on point, and it highlights, I think, the major problem that we have today. Millions of Americans perceiving other millions of Americans as not part of the same country, and a huge problem with what is truth. And this I think is the most worrisome thing of all. How can you have effective self-government when millions of people disagree with other millions over empirical reality? It lends itself to a situation where someone who wants to define the truth to serve his or her political ends can emerge to create a narrative. We've already seen it. We saw it during the 4 years of the Trump administration. And I fear it's only gotten worse. Propagated by social media, by willingness. And again, I voted for Republicans and Democrats and worked for Republicans and Democrats, but propagated by one of our two major political parties, who seem to have no respect for the conventions, traditions, or norms that have allowed America to at least pose itself as a big tent with a functional political system and a growing sense of inclusion on the part of so many humans in this country who were excluded from the American story, from the American narrative, from American life, from American politics for so long. That's basically broken down now. And I want to believe that in effect, the American experiment will get through this. I have no other choice but to believe, frankly, was to accept the dystopias, the dystopic realities that are maybe credibly being relayed about civil war, about secession, about coup d'etats. I mean, vigilant, yes, but it's just hard for me to untether myself from the notion, John Meacham's notion. He's now more or less the official historian of the Biden administration. And I say that with respect, I say that with respect, that we've been through worse. And the so-called soul of America, with all of its imperfections, has survived. I worry greatly now that the next 2 years will be the most critical in the history of the country.
So we will go to Max, and then I'll kick it to Aaron for any last thoughts he has. Max, over to you.
Hi, Justin. Thanks, Aaron. I wanted to run a theory by you. It's occurred to me that maybe the justification for Biden's overly cautious approach to returning to the Iran deal is that perhaps he thought that the political fallout from a JCPOA return could derail the Afghanistan withdrawal, which he saw as the much more urgent and higher priority from a national security standpoint, and also just in terms of his personal interests and his legacy and the urgency of it and in needing to get it done in year one. And the reason I ask is because I'm not sure what the political calculation would be otherwise. It's not like the situation was ever going to get better over time as Iran is getting closer and closer to having nuclear weapons capability, as tensions could boil over on the border with Lebanon, as you're getting closer and closer to midterms. Nothing's going to get easier politically. So what was the idea, do you think, in the Biden political calculus, and why didn't they do anything early on to try to put more time on the clock for diplomacy?
It's a good question, and critics have argued that like many of the unilateral acts which were done by executive order, rejoining the WHO, reversing the Muslim ban, rejoining Paris Climate, that the president simply should have checked the box, even in a White House signing ceremony, check the box and basically rejoin the JCPOA. The problem, I think, is that you had an inherent. First of all, they got into this late during the spring of 2021. The transition was obviously fraught, to say the least. And remember, the onus of culpability was on the United States. I don't have a brief for Iran here, but the fact is, the Trump administration decided to unilaterally abrogate this agreement. The Iranians then came back and thought to themselves, I'm sure, well, look, we didn't step out of this. The Americans did. So there are any number of compensatory elements that we want in. We want compensation for the destruction to our economy that was done. We want to ensure somehow that in 2 or 3 years, the administration doesn't simply return to the deal. Withdraw from the deal under another administration. So I think you had that. You had Iranian desires for a better deal. You had an inherent risk aversion, which was not left over, which was adamant even at the time when the JCPOA was signed among Republicans. This was a bad deal. It didn't cover ballistic missiles. It didn't cover Iran's malign activities in the region. We needed a better deal. The JCPOA was inherently flawed. So these two things, I think, combined with an inherent sense of priorities, that getting back into this agreement would take time. I think that's what they argued. And they weren't simply going to open themselves up to returning to an accord that was deemed so unpopular and so toxic with respect to both Republicans and Democrats. So they hesitated and they waited. And then, of course, after 5 or 6 rounds by June of last year, you had the Iranian delay of elections. You had Raisi election as president. You had a further toughening of Iranian demands, including upping enrichment, shutting out the IAEA, which compounded itself. Plus, you had Iranian policies in the region. And a counterbalancing with the Abraham Accords, growing Israeli contacts with the Emiratis. I think they figured that there were simply too many domestic political priorities, and that they would have to wait, if only to appear to be to being tough with the Iranians and negotiating up until the last minute. And now they find themselves in a situation where the odds of a fully comprehensive return to the deal are probably small. They're toying with a less for less deal, less sanctions relief for some compliance, not all, probably on the enrichment side, in an effort to do something to stabilize the situation. Because it's one key issue to watch. The situation is going to drift without an agreement or without negotiations to achieve one. You're into drift and deterioration, and that may hold for quite a while. I don't think the Iranians want to court an Israeli attack or an American one, but I think it's only a matter of time until events basically take over, and you end up with a situation of potential conflict between Israel and Iran, and one that could draw the administration in.
Well,
Justin, I want to just say two things before we close. I've done this before, but I want to just read to everyone 3 or 4 lines from a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave in 1838 to the Young Men's Lyceum, because I think Lincoln, contemplating a political future he probably thought he would never have, basically devoted the speech to repurposing or rededicating the ideals of the founders. But he says something that I think applies and is chilling with respect to the kinds of problems that we face. Here's what he says. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? Remember, this is 1838. By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all of the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I just wanted to close by saying that whoever's listening, that you are incredibly fortunate to have Justin and this program at your disposal. He does some extraordinary things. It's not just the guests. It's the way he handles the moderation and the fact that he creates an environment for honest, serious, beyond civil, I would argue, the kind of friendly back and forth, honest back and forth, without rancor and tethered to a broader goal of truly trying to understand things that can't be reduced to bumper stickers and that are truly complex. So I want to thank you all for listening to me, and Justin, I want to thank you again for hosting me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be here.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Aaron, to the Carnegie Endowment, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. As a quick reminder, all of our events are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask a question. For information on how to join us, past episodes, and more, visit us at pm101.live. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.